Today we're going to talk about helping English language learners through a very popular model called SIOP. SIOP has great popularity among schools that reach a lot of English learners because it is the one program that we have now that has been quantitatively proven to be helpful for English learners in both their English proficiency and in being able to maintain content area standards as well while they're still learning English. So SIOP is both an observation protocol, which means it's a way for school administrators to observe you in the classroom, looking specifically at things that can help English learners be successful in your classroom, but it's also just a suggestion of best practices. So SIOP stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. So that observation protocol is what I just talked about, where the administrators have these 30 features of SIOP, which are 30 best practices, and they go into your classroom and evaluate you on each of those 30 features. But sheltered instruction is something that we definitely need to unpack. So sheltered instruction is, if you think about it from what the name implies, that we're sheltering instruction for our English learners. We're not changing the content, however, but we are sheltering them like an umbrella from the language demands of your content area. But you're also helping them to move forward in their language development within your content area. And so we'll unpack that much more for the next two lectures on SIOP. But sheltered instruction is where the English learner is learning the content area of their other native speaking peers. So content area being whether it's in the English class, literature class, or it could be in the biology or math class, things like that. They're still staying up with their native speakers, friends in the content while they're still learning English. And so it's kind of similar. I think of it as almost a parallel to special education in that it is actually like inclusion, where we have mainstreamed special needs students as much as possible into a regular classroom, and the special ed teacher co-teaches with the content area teacher to give the support they need to be successful in those content areas despite their disability. And so sheltered instruction is similar in that it's training the content area teachers to help their their English language learning students in the classroom, in the regular classroom. However, we aren't to the point yet, and I don't know that we ever will be, where there's a ELL teacher co-teaching with the content area teacher. That does not typically happen. So you may find, for example, if you are teaching in a school that has a good amount of English learners, that you may have 8 to 10 out of 25 students in your class that are English language learners of different varying degrees of language progression. And so you will have to use these SIOP features in order to meet those students' needs, and you will be held accountable for that. If your school has really chosen to follow the SIOP model, then you will probably be observed based on that, and your lesson plans will need to be written to exemplify SIOP lesson plans as well. There are, though, too, some schools where they have so many special needs English language students that there are some content area teachers, so they're trained in a particular content area or a particular certification. They're not ELL trained or certified, but they still have an entire class of English language learning students. So you may have, well, let me just give you an example. A student that just graduated from Grove City last year teaches biology in Virginia, and he teaches inclusion biology, which means he has a good amount of students who are have IEPs, individual educational plans. However, down the hall, one of his biology colleagues teaches the sheltered instruction biology class, which means most of her students in that class are ELLs, and she has been trained in SIOP enough to know how to shelter her instruction for those ELLs so that they can continue progressing in English within the biology classroom while also keeping up with the state standards for science. the structure of SIOP includes 8 components that are just kind of some basic elements of teaching. And then with each component, there are a few features. Depending on the component, there could be anywhere from 5 or 6 features to just 2 or 3 that describe what the content area teacher needs to be doing for the students within that component. And the features, again, there are 30 features in all. We're going to go over those 30, some in more detail than others, because what you'll find is a lot of these features aren't just specific to ELLs, but they're things that you're learning at Grove City College are just good teaching in general. But the thing I want you to think about while we're going through these ideas is why is it that the ELLs especially need for you to commit to these 30 features. And also, there are a few features that are specific to ELLs because of the fact that they're still learning the language while they're also learning your content. So the 8 components are, and you don't have to write these down, be sure when you're taking notes on this lecture that you refer to in your course packet. There is a SIOP observation protocol worksheet in your packet. So you will see that it has like a place for your name, the day of lesson, something like that. And then it has all of these, and that's the actual evaluation tool that some administrators use. So it has every single component, and then within each component it gives you the features. So you don't need to copy all that down from the lecture, but have it out to refer to, and you might take notes on it and things like that. That's yours to keep, so you're welcome to annotate it as much as you want. So the 8 features include lesson preparation, which is the one that we're going to be talking about especially today, because that one, if you don't have a good lesson prepared ahead of time, then nothing else can happen for your ELLs or your regular ed students. So we're going to spend more time on lesson preparation than the rest of the components. And then building background for your students, we'll talk about next time. Comprehensible input, meaning making sure that what you're giving the students, what you're putting in to their brains, so to speak, is understandable for them. The strategies you're using in the classroom, the interaction opportunities you're giving your ELLs, the opportunity that they have to practice and apply the concepts that you're teaching them, how you actually deliver the lesson, and then finally, what are you doing to review and assess them, and how often is that happening, how specific are you with the assessment. So today, again, we're going to talk about lesson preparation, and this is where you'll see some very things that are specific to the ELL. So the lesson preparation features, there are 6 of them. So again, if you don't have a great lesson prepared, then everything falls apart. Your classroom management, being able to deal with behavior will fall apart because your students will sense that you're not prepared, and that will give them opportunity to kind of get off task. But also the way you're interacting with the students, your ability to keep on the pulse of the classroom and see where they are, all of that is dependent on your preparation beforehand. So the good news is that that's all you, right? That's sweat equity. So however much you're putting into this lesson can have a lot to do with your success. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're out in the field doing a lesson that you have prepared, and also during student teaching, that you really need to devote a lot of time to your lesson preparations. So first we're going to talk about the top 2, and that's content objectives and language objectives that are clearly defined, displayed, and reviewed with students. So first of all, this is true for all of your classes, whether you have ELLs or not. It's really important that you simplify your content objectives for your students. So you know that here at Grove City College, Madeline Hunter is a queen, and so you've been taught in your Foundations of Teaching class, perhaps, maybe reinforced in Ed Psych, that you write a very long, messy, not really messy, but very long-winded objective, where you first state the kind of the input. Given small group work in stations, the students will be able to identify similes, metaphors, and hyperbole to a level of 80% proficiency. Okay, the students don't need all of that jargon up on the board, and they don't need for you to review all of that jargon. Okay, That is good to have on your lesson plan, don't get me wrong. I'm not negating what you learned in Ed Psych or Foundations, but it's important for you to keep things simple for your students for the purpose of sharing with them. So make sure you have your simplified objectives on the board and that you share that with them at the beginning and the end of the class. So you can do that with the beginning. You can do that one of two ways. You could either start the class off, let's take a look at our objectives today, and I usually would just call on 2 or 3 different students to read each objective. You know, the first person would read the first objective, second person the second, and so on. And that was our chance to also say and make sure you write your homework down in your planner. Or you can wait till the end of your anticipatory set. So first you're grabbing their attention to get them excited about this lesson and say, this is what it's going to lead to. Let's look at the objectives now. And then you can pull them over to the objectives. But it's really important for you to share the objectives verbally with the students. Okay, Grovers, in my experience, are pretty good. You're great at writing the objectives typically. And some of you are pretty good at putting them up on the board. Some school districts in the area actually require that you put the daily objectives up on the board. But even when I see student teachers doing that, a lot of times they forget to go over them with the students. And if it's up on the board but you don't go over it, chances are most students aren't going to read that. So why even bother, right? So it's just really important for you to actually take the time to share the objectives with the student. And notice I said back at the end of the lesson as well. So try to get in the habit of, in your closure, going back and having the students, you could even have a student come up to the board, read the objective, and poll the class. Did we achieve this today? And if they did, putting a check mark on it. So that's teaching them kind of a life skill of a type of to-do list and goal setting, and then monitoring whether you met the goal or not. One more thing though, with the objectives. I want you to take a moment now. I didn't do this yet, but we do it as a class. Take a moment to think about how you would simplify the objective in the example that I have on this slide. Where would you start? Like, what would you share with the students? What I would suggest to you is to start with identify. So you're starting with the verb. Okay, so anything after the students will be able to. Just start right there and say our objectives today are we're going to identify similes, metaphors, and hyperbole. That's it. They don't need to know to a level of 80% proficiency. Okay, so just have objectives written on the board and then number them. And then number 1 is identify similes, metaphors, and hyperbole. Number 2 is to create your own simile, perhaps, or metaphor, something like that. So just start with the verb is the simplest way. Make sure that when you're sharing your objectives that you're not confusing that with the agenda. Okay, and so this is an example of a student who I observed in Houston, Texas. She was actually already a teacher, but she was earning her certification while she was a teacher. In Texas, you can do that because there's such a teacher shortage because of the increase in population. And so she learned from me to have a place for her agenda on the board as well as her objectives. So here, I like that. I thought that was interesting. She calls them test objectives. So maybe focusing on what we're doing as a class to prepare for the standardized test. You can do that, or you can just say objectives, either way. But notice that she too starts with just the verb. Differentiate by atom and element, I think it says. This is a science class. Identify physical and something, it's kind of hard for me to see. But anyway, she has several objectives. That's kind of a lot of objectives, actually. Most days you will have 2 to 3 objectives would be plenty for the students. You don't want to overwhelm them, and you don't want to smash too much into one lesson. But then notice that the agenda is actually different than the objectives. The objectives are your learning goals for the day. What are they going to learn? The agenda is kind of the how. So in this case, she just put when their project was due. But if I had on my agenda, I always had a place for my objectives and a place for my agenda. My agenda was actually kind of on a sideboard, whereas my objectives were at the front of the classroom. But you can do it however you want. But I would put number 1, lab. Number 2, go over answers as a class. Number 3, start on homework. And then I would put the homework underneath, in which she had homework listed there too, it looks like. So just make sure that you have the what is kind of the objectives and the how is your agenda. And I've seen some some schools, I think Sharon City School District, they are required to put the how, the what, and perhaps the why. You could also do a what, how, and then so what, which is kind of like why. Or you could say now what. So you could say, the what is the objectives, the how is your plan for how we're going to do that today, and then the now what could be homework or what we're going to do tomorrow. So there are different ways that you can deal with that in your own class. So just do what suits you and your what you believe would be most effective. Language objectives are something, this is where I was telling you some of SIOP is very specific for English learners. So when you have English learners in your classroom, you really have to take the time to think about, with every lesson, what am I going to do today that is going to place language demands on my ELLs. You're always going to have language objectives. You're always doing something with language. I don't care if you're a math teacher, a PE teacher, a music teacher, a science teacher. We're all using language in our classrooms. So when you're thinking about your language objectives, think about the 4 language skills being reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Okay, so you're doing, you may not do all 4 in one lesson, but you're doing either speaking, listening, writing, or reading. They're going to have to do one of those 4 during your class at least, if not all 4 or a couple of them. So you need to specify that not only in your lesson plan, but also share with the students what their language objectives are going to be for the day. So the language objectives focus on the student's academic language development in your content area. So you want to make sure that the language objectives aren't something that they already know how to do, but are something that they're progressing with, or may even be something that they're being introduced with for the first time. And so it may be helpful for you to distinguish between receptive and productive language skills. So receptive skills are those in which the students are receiving the information, so they're taking it in. That's the input. And so think about, out of those 4 language skills I just shared with you, which ones are the ones where they're receiving the information? Hopefully you're thinking the listening, right? Because you're taking in information when you listen. And then when they are reading, they're taking in the information when they're reading. Those are the receptive skills. Okay. Productive are where they're producing something for someone else, perhaps you or for their classmates. So that is going to be when they speak in your class, are required to speak in your class, and when they are required to write in your class. And so we really need to make sure that we're developing all 4 of these in your class, no matter what your content area is. Make sure you're giving enough language opportunity in the classroom for them to increase their English development within your content area, within academic language of your content area. So the receptive is easier for them to acquire, but they need to have that practice in productive language skills as well. A lot of times my math students think that they don't need their students to write in their class. This is a math class, it's not an English class. However, I want to give you a heads up that is changing in some states that take standardized testing seriously. And so where I taught in Tennessee 5 years ago, my math colleagues were required to have their students write in math class every day. And so at the end of class, I know one of my colleagues said that she wrote or had the students write a paragraph about how they actually solve the problem. What is the process that you have to go to solve the problem? And that's going to be more of an emphasis with Common Core, which is really trying to build the students in math. It's trying to build the students' understanding of what's happening behind formula and the numbers that they're talking about. And so I see on my son's 5th grade homework, a lot of times he has to explain the process he went to, or explain why, what was happening in the problem that he just solved. So make sure that you're doing that in your lessons as well. And so if that's happening, you're going to have to support some of those those writing demands of your English learners if they're in the lower stages of their English development. So here are some examples of language objectives, ways that you can pull language objectives into your classroom, or thinking about what you're already doing, but being able to articulate that they are language objectives. So if you're introducing new words, then that would be a language objective. So the vocabulary of the lesson. The reading comprehension. So if they're reading a section out of the textbook, then that would be a language objective. Even again in math, I keep talking about math because I think sometimes it's harder for the math teachers to see, make their connection to language. But reading story problems and solving story problems can also be a reading comprehension as well. Writing process skills, so writing a paragraph or writing, a letter to someone, different types of writing tasks would also be language objectives. Having to provide explanations, so that's what I was just talking about, where students have to explain a problem and how they solved it. Justifying their opinion, making predictions. We do that a lot in literature, where we have them predict what's going to happen next in a novel. Summarizing. That can happen also in history classes, also English classes as well, science classes where you have them summarize a concept that they just read in the textbook, and then making comparisons. So all of these things are language activities, okay? So once you articulate that as a language objective for your ELLs, then you need to think about how you're going to make scaffolds for your ELLs so that they can do those things, okay? And the language objectives may be different based on where your students are, whether they are entering. Remember from the your exploration of WIDA in the previous lesson. So if they are entering, or they are developing, or reaching, or bridging, that's going to how you adapt these language objectives are going to be dependent on that. So you may have different language objectives for different students in your class. And if that's the case, I would encourage you to have a way to share that individually with the students instead of putting the language objectives right below your content objectives, because they're going to be different per student. You might put the language objectives for the reaching students who are the closest to the native speakers on the board, but then have a card or on their notes for the day at the top the language objectives for students of varying levels of language proficiency. But never feel like it's a negative that students are at different levels of their English, because if you think that that's a negative, that that's something they should be ashamed of, then they're going to pick up on that, and so are their classmates. So it's important for you to meet them where they are and not be ashamed of that, but instead embrace the fact that they are learning English in addition to another language, which is an incredible thing that perhaps you haven't even done yet. So some criteria for your language objectives, and you need to, with your English language learning lesson plan that you're writing for this class, you need to make sure you have language objectives as part of your lesson plan, okay? So make sure that they are measurable, just like you learned in Foundations of Teaching with your content objectives. They should be measurable so you know whether the student is able to do those language objectives or not. They should be understandable to the students. So again, when you share them with the students, start with the verb and try to kind of simplify it for them based on what you know about their language progression so far. It should promote academic language growth. Again, it shouldn't be something that they already do well, but something that they're working on or striving to do. Okay, so for example, I teach the English ed majors who are going to be high school teachers, right? So sometimes I'll come across a student who has a 10th grade lesson plan, and they say for one of their content objectives, the students will be able to read the short story. Okay, well their students already know how to read, so that's really not an objective, it's an activity. That moves over to agenda, not objective. The objectives are something that we're striving for, that we're constantly trying to grow into. Okay, so make sure that the academic language growth is something that they're still learning to do. and it should definitely connect to the day's lessons or activities or information. So in the sample English language learning lesson plan that is posted on my GCC for you, what I did to create that, it's a student's lesson plan actually, Sarah Hauber, who's going to be a senior in 2014, and Taryn Cole. I just read through their lesson plan, and I took the content objectives and said, okay, what are they going to be, what do these imply about language? But then I also read through the lesson plan to see what all do the students need to do with language to be able to do this lesson. And that's where I got my language objectives. So those language objectives should definitely connect with what the students are doing in your class today. So while you don't need to have a lot of language objectives, one or two perhaps, but what I'm going to be doing when I read your lesson plan is see where you could lose points is where if I read through and see that they're doing something with language as a class, or the whole class is, but you haven't specified what that means for the ELL in your language objectives. So if you miss one where it's showing that they're doing something with language in the activities, but you haven't stated it as a language objective, then you might miss some opportunities for points. So just kind of double check yourself on that. And then you have a plan for assessing the student's progress on these objectives. So formative assessment or summative assessment, but how are you going to know whether they're progressing in their language development? So we've talked about content and language objectives. If you are still kind of concerned about understanding how to write a language objective, you are welcome to email me and just send me a sample, an example of a language objective that you play with, that you try to do, and I can give you some feedback on that and let you know if you're on track or not. My experience has been when I teach this in the regular semester that students they think they're confused about language objectives, but then when they go to write one, they're spot on. Okay, so it might seem a little bit intimidating, but I think you can do it. Okay, but I'm also very happy to help you through the process and also through the process of writing your ELL lesson plan as well, because I just want this to be something that you learn from and that you feel confident going into student teaching, because you may very well have ELLs that you're teaching in student teaching that you feel confident and know what to do to be successful or help them be successful. So now let's talk just for a moment about content concepts that are appropriate in age and educational background. This is pretty much common sense, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it. But I do want to say that we have to really be careful not to make the mistake of, because our ELLs are still learning English, to give them materials that are beneath their age level and interest level. Okay, so just because they are at a beginning reading level in English doesn't mean that they should be using those step 1 readers, that are on Dora the Explorer or something like that when they're in 5th or 6th grade. There is a lot out there right now, and when you go to educational conferences, which I hope you will before you graduate and then also continue that as a professional, when you go to those conferences, you will find that there are plenty of vendors who are creating really rich resources that have adapted language in them, but are still content appropriate age level. So they're at the level of the student, their grade level with content, but they're just changing the language so that it's not as demanding for the reader. And so you can find actual magazines that do that, so things that they can read that are high interest magazines, books, textbooks have been adapted for ELLs as well. So just really, this is a place for you to be an advocate for your students, to actually have them or go find with your administrators. You might have to write a grant, but sometimes it may be just calling the your sales rep for your textbook company and asking them for these materials. The textbook publishers know that ELLs is that they are our greatest increase in population in America, and so they are fast producing great resources for you to draw on. So let's talk now about supplemental materials used to a high degree. So this, again, is something that definitely needs to be in your lesson plan. So make sure that you copy down some of these examples of supplemental materials. You will also find in your WIDA packet that there was a list of potential supports that you can provide students when you are doing your MPI. There were supports listed there as well. But these examples of supplemental materials, we'll have some others as well that we talk about, and I believe that there's also a handout in your packet that talks about supplementals, or actually I think it's about language objectives. So just take a look where you see your SIOP worksheet. Around that same area should be some examples for you as well for your language objectives, and there might be something in there as well for supplementals. But some supplementals that you can use are hands-on manipulatives. Just last week I was in a doctor's office, and they are looking at a disc in my neck, in my spine, and so he took two models of, just those little plastic models of the spine with the disc, and he had one with the healthy disc and one with the deteriorating disc, and so he showed it to me. If I wanted to, I didn't, but I could hold it in my hand and play with it and feel it. Those are hands-on manipulatives, and so with the manipulatives, sometimes I've seen teachers use them at the front of the room, but it's more powerful and it's more likely to go into the student's long-term memory if they get a chance to play with those hands-on manipulatives themselves. So whenever you're able to actually put them in their hands, maybe working in small groups and things, then that's really helpful. The curriculum library has a lot of hands-on manipulatives that you can check out and use in your classroom during student teaching or field experience. So I really encourage you to go and explore and see what Mrs. Harold has there for you to use. Math is a great class to use manipulatives in for the students to understand what's happening in the background of the math problem, and then also science classes as well, using labs and so forth are examples of using hands-on learning. Realia is bringing real-life objects into your classroom. That again can help the ELLs because they see exactly what it is you're talking about. I showed last week my class a teacher teaching about chemicals in a chemistry class, and she brought several different household items that have chemicals in them. And so that's an example of using realia. Pictures, it's really important for you to use a lot of clip art, Google Images, whatever it takes, whenever possible with your ELLs in the earlier development, whether it's entering or the level just after that. That will really help them connect the words to meaning in their own language. So even in your classroom, having places where you have a word and maybe a word in their language as well, if you can, to show that chalkboard is, I think, is it pizza in Spanish? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting right now. But so I would have pizza and chalkboard written on the on a card next to the chalkboard, things like that. But then in the on a handout, if I'm giving directions on something, if I am asking them to draw a picture of something, then I might have actually a picture of someone drawing something, like a pencil with a little person that they're making on a worksheet or something like that. So think about what they are not, anticipate what they're not going to know with the language, and then fill it in with pictures whenever possible. Same thing with visuals like maps, using maps in your classroom, timelines of events, bulletin boards, etc. And so bulletin boards, when you student teach, or even in methods class, I know I teach English methods for secondary, and they are required to create a bulletin board that ties into their unit plan that they're teaching in the school, and it has to be interactive for the students. So a bulletin board isn't supposed to be a place for you to post all of your organizational items. It is an instructional tool. It is a type of multimedia almost. So it's a chance for you to grab the student's attention, to get creative, and to give them another avenue in which to interact. So all of those things are important for your ELLs as well. All of this, see how all of these things we've talked about are visual dependent. And so you really have to think about how you can use visual media to help them connect concepts to the language that they're still using. So the same with multimedia. The lesson plan that I've included as part of the example for you to look at to create your own ELL lesson plan, the women who wrote that lesson plan have, I think it's in their anticipatory set, they show a video called Good Times, which is actually, it's just a clip from a TV show from the 1970s that I used to watch when I'd come home from school. And it's about a family that live in the projects and are about to be evicted. And so that connects with the play A Raisin in the Sun. So showing something like that gives a broad sense of the concepts you're going to talk about for the ELL. And you're also kind of building their background knowledge, or helping everyone to have a little bit of background knowledge going into the play by using that multimedia. Demonstrating as well, so if your students are about to do a task, you demonstrating it first is really helpful to ELLs and all of your students. Using related literature, perhaps having them read a nonfiction article first, or you read that as a class first before they go into another piece, or something shorter. Sometimes when I taught English, if we were reading a novel or a play, I'd bring in a poem that dealt with the same theme. So just showing connections, even children's stories. So it's great to use children's stories to connect a theme as well. And so you read it as a class, you show the students the pictures, you talk about that, and it sets them up for what they're about to talk about. I did that with, I remember using The Giving Tree, which is my husband's all-time favorite children's story. I can't really remember what else I was teaching at the time, but I remember that the students, they were freshmen in high school, but they still enjoyed us talking about the Giving Tree and kind of the lessons that are a part of it. I think I had them write about whether they were the tree or the boy in the story or something, so we were talking about perspective and also ourselves and who we want to be as a human being. High-low readers are basically readers that are leveled based on where they are with their proficiency so far, their progress in reading. And then adapted text I've used as well, where especially with something like Shakespeare that we teach in high school, and I would have to teach Shakespeare to a class where I had in one classroom students who were reading at a college level and students who were still at a second grade level of reading, all in one class. And so what helped me was to have adapted text where on one side of the page it was written just as Shakespeare had written it, and on the other side was a more Americanized version of the text. So everything was still happening in the play in the same way. The same characters are saying the same types of things, but the language was simpler on one side of the page than the other. And so you can look for adapted text as well. So it's also important to adapt the content to all levels of student proficiency. So that is going to be, again, part of your lesson plan. So if you look at the sample lesson plan on MyGCC, you will find under adaptations or accommodations that I give for each objective, or each activity that the students are doing. I tell you how that's adapted for the ELLs, and then the included behind the lesson plan are the resources that the students need for the lesson. So it might be a worksheet that's going to be passed out, and so those are adapted for each level of proficiency that we're working toward, which are, there are 3 different levels. So you'll find that there are 3 different adaptations made for each of the activities. So here are some ways to adopt content. So again, this is a good thing for you to note down. Helping students with graphic organizers. This helps them to see connections between concepts. So if you go to Microsoft Word and hit Insert, there's an option for Smart Art, it's called, and if you click on that, you will find tons of templates for graphic organizers. This is something that you could definitely add as an adaptation in your lesson plan, where perhaps, like sometimes I would adapt I always adapted my tests for my inclusion students and my regular ed students, and so everyone had to write an essay for their test. The regular ed students, I just gave them the prompt. They had to compare and contrast the familial love between the Capulets and the Montagues, something like that. Whereas with my inclusion students, I had a graphic organizer that was partially filled in, that they could fill in the rest of it to help them plan out how they were going to write their paragraphs then on that essay. So it's just giving them more scaffolding on the content. You can also prepare outlines with varying amounts of blanks to fill in. So your students who are entering are going to have a lot more filled in, and you would probably add some clip art here and there to help them make meaning of what the notes say. Whereas someone in one of the later levels of language progression, you might just have blanks here and there for them to write in the word or concept. And you may not even, depending on what grade level you're teaching, if they are juniors or seniors in high school, you may not offer that outline to everyone in the class. Some of the students, you may say, I feel like you can outline this on your own based on the lecture, and I want to see how you do that. So I would still collect everyone's outlines, but some of them were completely student-made, and they get credit for that, and the others get credit for using the outline that's partially filled in. And the understanding in the class is positive in that we are all progressing toward being able to take notes independently. And so for some of you, I feel like you're there, but I still want to monitor it and make sure that you are successful with that. And for others, I'm still providing you a scaffold, but that scaffold will go away as you continue to progress. You can do the same thing with leveled study guides, basically that you're giving study guides with varying degrees of concepts already written in, and others have more holes in the blanks, so to speak, where the students have to record more information. And so the study guides would be perhaps for if you're having the students read a section of the textbook for homework or in class, you would just have that study guide to help them fill in as they go. And so that you have to remember too with number 2 and 3, you're not just helping them because there are a lot of words they don't know yet to be able to fill in that outline, but it also takes them much longer, right, to be able to write and produce language. And so if a lot of it's filled in for them, then it will be more manageable than if they have to do the same amount of writing as the native speakers. Okay, so you're trying to, again, you're not changing the content that they're learning, but you are providing a shelter from the language demands that can drag them down. If you remember reading about Rosa's day as an ELL student, mainstreamed, just keep in mind how long everything took her. It took her much longer, and that was overwhelming and discouraging, demotivating, and so she wouldn't come to school a lot. So we want to make sure that the tasks are actually manageable for our English learners. When you have students read in class, or to themselves independently or with a partner, highlighting the text can help. So with this, you could grab just a handful, however many ELLs you have in the classroom, go through and highlight the chapter yourself, like get your Sharpie or your highlighter and highlight things that you think they need to focus on. Because if they're reading a whole section of text, that's informational text, that's written at a higher level even than native speakers can sometimes read. The textbooks are. And so we want to, again, alleviate some of that language pressure. So just having them focus on key concepts will help them. And the same with the marginal notes, number 8. If you look at marginal notes, that's just you pulling some of your textbooks aside for the ELL and writing notes in the margin. Because remember, there are some words that are easy peasy to your native speakers, but they may be new to your ELLs. And so you can make notes on that in the margin, or you could leave them in a little note like, remember, this is like what we talked about last week, or something, to just make it more manageable for them. My husband and I do that in our Bibles with as soon as our son was born. When we write in our Bible, we'll say Ricky, and then write a little note to him in the Bible, knowing that he's going to inherit our Bible someday, and he can see that we were thinking about him during our study of God's Word. That was kind of off topic a bit, but anyway. And then the taped and adapted text are other ways to help students be able to continue with the content while still also learning, getting more familiar with the language. So you may be able to have an audio of the text, whether on a laptop or tablet, or just a old cassette tape, and have them sit somewhere with headphones and be able to listen to the reading while you're having others read silently. I saw one student teacher I had last year had a very large range of readiness in her English class, and she had a handful of students who would prefer to read to themselves, others who responded well to reading as a group, and then still others that would rather be read to. And so she divided her class in 3 and gave them the choice. If you want to read silently, you're going to come over here. If you're going to read in our small group, you can come with me over here. And if you want to be have it read on tape, then you can sit over here with headphones. And it worked really well. The students appreciated that choice, and everyone was still able to accomplish the task. You just have to be very observant of what's happening in your classroom to make sure everyone is staying on task while you're sitting with the group that's reading together. And then native language texts. So a lot of times you can find texts online that are in your students' native language. And if you're talking about your actual textbook that you're using, talk to your sales rep again and ask them if they can get you a copy of the textbook in your student's home language. Because a lot of times that should not be extra money for the school district, because they're paying for the whole package. And so my experience has been that the sales rep is always pretty quick and happy to give you the resources you need to use their text. The textbook industry is highly competitive, so they want to please you as the teacher. So meaningful activities that integrate concepts with language practice opportunities. When you're writing your lesson, you want to make sure that you are not just teaching the content, but you are integrating in it language practice. So one way to do this is called the the gradual release of responsibility. Let me see if I can draw it a bit here for you, because I don't have my pen, so we'll see. But a gradual release of responsibility starts like this, where it starts with first the teacher speaks. The teacher shows them how to do the concept. So teacher, this is terrible, I'm sorry. That's number 1. So the teacher models. Then it's the class. We do it together as a whole class, and that's a chance for the students to ask questions. Okay? So all of the class together does the sample. I'm just putting question marks here for giving students a chance to ask questions. Then once the teacher kind of formatively assesses how they are able to understand the concept as a class, then you move into partner work. So they try the same task again with a partner or small group. That's a small group. And only after that do they move to number 4, independent work. This has been, for me, when I've observed student teachers who are math, I always suggest this model. Because what sometimes math student teachers do is they start with teacher, and then they go straight down to individual, independent work. That's really looks bad about independent work, but that's what that's supposed to say. And so it's like the teacher's with them and then sends them off a cliff to try it on their own. So this is called gradual release of responsibility, because you're gradually giving the students the responsibility. You're gradually releasing your responsibility, passing it on to the students. So do you see, why would I be talking to you about this with number 6? Where's the language practice happening? It's happening in number 2. And if they don't speak in number 2, which teachers should be cold calling on them some to encourage that language practice, but it's definitely happening here with number 3, okay? And perhaps number 4 if there are language demands in the task. So if you get into a habit of doing this type of model, then you're making sure that you have language practice all the time. Another thing that helped me as a teacher make sure that I have enough language practice in the classroom was configuring my desks into teams of 6. Because when I walked in the classroom every day, I had a visual reminder that I should be having cooperative learning at some point in that lesson. And that cooperative learning sometimes just takes the shape of think, pair, share. But other times it's a more extensive activity. Perhaps they're traveling from station to station, but they are learning together. Keep in mind, you may talk about this in Ed Psych, I'm not sure, but the brain feeds off social interaction. Our dendrites really grow when we are sharing information together. So our brain is social, it learns better in social situations. So you should really make cooperative learning a natural part of your daily lessons. So that is it for the lesson preparation. Again, I encourage you to take a look at the sample that's on MyGCC, the ELL lesson plan sample, and then also look at your rubric for the ELL lesson plan so that you know what I'm going to be looking for. Remember that you can actually adapt a lesson that you've already written in the past if you want, or if you want to continue growing as a teacher, I would suggest that you try to write a new lesson plan on a new topic with the ELL in mind. So the two big things I'm going to be looking at in your lesson plan are your language objectives and then how you're adapting the lesson. I've had students ask me in the past, can they put in within the development of the lesson what they're changing, what's going to be different for their ELLs, and that's absolutely fine. When you do that, however, it would be helpful for me when I'm reading it for you to put in parentheses if something's dealing with or something that the emerging or entering student is going to do, put entering in parentheses after it. So just label what activities and what scaffolds are for which student, okay? But I'm really looking at the language objectives and then your adaptations to see if they are truly what the students need to be able to accomplish the content tasks of the day and also develop their language proficiency. Tomorrow we will look at the rest of SIOP, so basically the last 7 components and the remaining features of SIOP. And then you're going to get a chance to evaluate. So there are 2 SIOP evaluations in your packet. So you will get a chance to evaluate a teacher on how well they do with SIOP. Have a great afternoon or morning or evening, whatever it is for you. Thank you.